Hello and welcome everyone. We're going to get started. I just wanted to let you know before we get into the content of the webinar that this webinar is being recorded. So just so you're aware, we will share it with some of our supporters and other people who weren't able to attend this afternoon. So welcome to Budget 2019 Be Part of the Process webinar. I'm Kathleen Walsh. I'm the Director of Policy here at Evidence for Democracy, and I'm with Katie Gibbs, our Executive Director.
Hi everyone, I'm Katie Gibbs. As Kat said, I'm the Executive Director here at E4D. For those who don't know, we're a nonpartisan, not-for-profit organization promoting the transparent use of evidence in government decision-making. And we do this through a few different approaches. We educate Canadians about why science is important and why it matters for our democracy. We do some original independent research, mostly on sort of science integrity issues in government. And we do issue-based campaigns as issues arise. Right now, we have a campaign going on in Ontario, encouraging the government to quickly rehire a qualified chief science advisor. And of course, we do trainings like these as well to really help sort of empower and boost the skills of the science community. So I'm going to chime back in with some quick housekeeping about Zoom. I know many of you had joined our last meeting, which was on Fuse. This is some new technology for our webinars, but hopefully some of you are already familiar with it. We are going to be using the Q&A function today, so if you have questions specific to the content, you can use the Q&A. And you'll see a Q&A option, and you'll be able to input your question with the option to send it anonymously if you would like, and hit send. That question will only be seen by Katie and I until it's answered, and then we will flag it. And we're also going to use the chat function. It's great to have chat so that you all can talk amongst yourselves, or just let us know if you, for example, can't hear or you're having issues with the slides. We're happy to send them by email. So you can click on the chat function and make sure that you have the chat to all panelists and attendees so everyone can see what you have to say. And on that, if you could take a minute and use the chat function to introduce yourself quickly. Just tell us a little bit about you, either your research area or maybe the organization you're representing, and what you'd like to learn from today. And in the meantime, I'm going to hand it back over to Katie while you're all introducing yourselves in the chat. Yeah, so just an overview of what we're going to go over today. So we're going to start by looking back at last year's pre-budget process. So the kind of engagement that went on leading into the budget, and then we'll talk about budget 2018, what was in it, what was not in it, and then Kat's going to go over sort of the nitty-gritty, how the sausage is made of federal budget process, and how you can participate as researchers, and then we'll talk a little bit about what are some of the specific things that we're looking to see in budget 2019. And then we hope to leave lots of time for specific questions from you guys. So looking back at last year's budget, certainly we can't talk about last year's budget without also talking about the Naylor report. So most of you are probably very familiar, but I'll just give a really fast overview in case some people aren't. So in spring of 2017, a report came out with many recommendations for how to improve fundamental science in Canada. And the report was initiated by government and chaired by Dr. David Naylor, hence why it's often referred to as the Naylor report. And like I said, there were a lot of recommendations in there. It was a very hefty report. This included, of course, sort of the biggest thing that everyone got behind was this request for more funds for investigator-led fundamental research. But there were also a bunch of other recommendations around things like a national advisory council, a coordinating body, which the government has created, as well as raising issues in there around equity targets and quotas to address
the significant gender inequality at many stages in the research pipeline in Canada, as well as increased support for early career researchers. And so, this really is what sort of created the foundation for a lot of organizations' asks around the last budget. And for those who have been following this for a while, you'll recall that the government's response to the report was originally cool. They didn't immediately get behind the report, but the science community sort of banded together in a very unique way and led a really inspiring campaign to really make the case that the government needed to support the report. And so these actions around support the report took many different forms, but one of them was engaging in the budget process last year. And I think for many people in the research community, this was the first time that they had ever, submitted a pre-budget brief, for example. And so we were curious to see if the numbers would actually show this. And so we looked at the submissions to finance in 2015, 2016, and 2017. And we searched about 20 different science keywords. And you can see the percentage of science-themed submissions doubled from 2016 to 2017. So we did see a big sort of surge in science-related submissions last year, which was really great to see. But one thing I think that is really interesting and kind of surprising is how few submissions there actually are. So, even in 2017 and basically every year, there's usually around 400 submissions. But if you consider, how many people there are in Canada and even just how many sort of interest groups there are, it's kind of surprising to me that there's usually only around 400 submissions. And I think to me that also shows that they're really, even just, 5 researchers submitting briefs is actually enough to sort of change the makeup of what is submitted, given that so few are received by the government. So I think that this is really an area where researchers can have a lot of influence. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what was in Budget 2018 to sort of help us think about what wasn't there and what we're going to ask for in 2019. So, of course, Budget 2018 was, I think, by everyone's account, a very good budget for science. We did see a lot of new money for the tri-councils to really go to that base funding for basic research. We saw $925 million over 5 years. And then there were some other sort of goodies in there as well. There was this new tri-council interdisciplinary fund, some funding for the Canada Research Chairs. We did see permanent funding for CFI. And we did see some money for sort of collecting more data on issues around diversity and equity. So those were all sort of related to academic research. We did see some aspects in the budget as well for intramural government research. These are all still a little bit more fuzzy in that we're still sort of trying to figure out exactly what these mean. So, for example, the National Research Council got some money as part of a reimagining. So we're not entirely sure what that is going to look like, but it does look like they're sort of shifting it back to more of its historic role of doing research versus, under the Harper years, it was very much shifted to being very much about commercialization and industry research. So we think this reimagining is going to be a bit of a shift away from that. One of the largest line items in the budget was actually this $2.8 billion for federal science infrastructure. And so we're pretty sure that that is going to be some actual new buildings here in Ottawa to house government scientists. There were some funds for polar knowledge and some interesting little pots of money around Indigenous research, So Statistics Canada, for example, is going to create the Indigenous Statistical Capacity Development Initiative, which is great to see, and also some money for SSHRP to develop a strategic plan that identifies how to better do research with Indigenous communities. So definitely there was some good things in budget 2018 for sure, but not everything that we were looking for. So some things that we were looking for that we didn't see in budget 2018. I think the big one was definitely scholarships, and so this was mentioned in the budget. They sort of said, we're looking at this, and I think at the time a lot of us interpreted that as meaning that this was something that they were planning to fund maybe a little bit later down the road. We're now kind of hearing maybe a little bit of backtracking there, that they're sort of saying, no, we're just going to, assess it and maybe see how we can move around the existing funds. And certainly for us here at E4D, climate science was a big thing that we had been looking for. We had been pushing for them to refund the CCAR program that funded climate and atmospheric research. We did not see any money earmarked for climate science, and in fact, the Pearl laboratory that we had been campaigning for the past year, that we did get some funding for, it still only has funds until September of 2019. So its future is still uncertain. And while we did see that big line item for government science infrastructure, there really wasn't any big increase for capacity within government science. So there wasn't really new money for actually hiring back government scientists. And still for the Naylor Report recommendations, there was a lot of money there, but the money did not meet the full Naylor Report recommendation. So the line item around the increase in funding for the tri-councils, for example, was about 60% of what was asked for in the Naylor Report. So, no doubt it was a good budget, but there are still some things that we're still looking for. And so that is really what is sort of inspiring our budget 2019 asks. So we'll talk a little bit about those specific asks right at the end. But after this, Kat is going to talk through the federal budget process, what are the input points, and talk a little bit about some of the other long-term reasons why we want to do this work. Over to Kat.
Great, thanks, Katie. So as Katie mentioned, we're going to take a quick look at how a budget is actually made. And this slide is a depiction, I guess, of what we might see from the outside. So how the budget process looks to us. And I know Katie mentioned it being how the sausage is made. I like to use a bread analogy. And that you'll hear that quite often, because at a certain point from the outside, the budget's really half-baked, and it's in the oven. So there is a point where no amount of lobbying or letters is going to change a big amount of the budget or a large direction of it. But let's start at the top here. So July and August, Parliament is really collecting their ingredients. They're taking stock, figuring out what they're working with, what absolutely needs to be in the budget, and making those suggestions. So this phase generally continues through the fall and into November. At this point, Parliament will hear from individuals and groups at pre-budget hearings, and the Department of Finance will allow submissions directly to the department. So you'll see a lot of handshaking, public events, the finance minister, quote unquote, talking to Canadians. And then all of these pieces start to come together around December, where they're really meeting the budget, working it out, and sticking it in the oven. So any major changes to the general priorities are unlikely by December. And then voila, February or early March, a fresh budget appears. And that's when we can start slicing it up and dissecting it a bit. And in contrast to all of that, which seems a little complicated, but this takes it to the next level,
This is the parliamentary financial cycle from the Library of Parliament, and it does look quite confusing and complicated, but it really gives a glimpse of how the processes overlap. So I don't think it's worth getting into all the weeds on this, but I want to point out how much is happening to a budget at all times, all year. So we're already talking about budget 2019, and we're kind of in the thick of it for the first round of pre-budget submissions, but really the budget document was approved less than a month ago. So budget 2018 only passed in Parliament at the end of June. So it all kind of overlaps. And really, it's important to keep in mind what's happening, because the budget is one of the main ways that you're going to influence government priorities. And I mean, there's still work to be done outside of budget time, like outside of pre-budget consultations, et cetera. And so it's worth keeping in mind that even if you do sort of, miss that pre-budget consultation period, or you didn't get in every single thing you wanted, really the budget provides envelopes and buckets of money, and then you can sort of shape what those buckets look like. So for example, in budget 2018, it was announced that there would be a new Tri-Council fund for interdisciplinary research. What that actually looks like is still being shaped. And a note on budget processes: if this all sounds confusing and overwhelming, or a little bit much, it's not you, it's them. The International Budget Partnership carries out an open budget survey every year, and they score countries on 3 factors: so transparency, public participation, and oversight. The transparency in the survey is about the availability, utility, and accessibility of the series of documents released throughout the financial cycle, so that complicated parliamentary cycle that we mentioned. So the public engagement piece is how civic engagement happens around that process, and then the oversight refers mostly to legislative oversight, but also a little bit to what's available for us. So on that, Canada got a B- or 71% on transparency, an F on public participation, which is not good, 39%, and 57% or a D or D+ on oversight. So really, this whole process does need quite a bit of work, but it's, all that to say there are ways to participate and insert yourself. And that being said, let's talk a little bit about how you can be part of the process. And these are really tried and true ways that you can engage. And it's imperfect, but as Katie mentioned earlier, making your voice heard on behalf of science does actually make an impact. So all of this is summarized in our pre-budget toolkit, which we'll send around to you. If you haven't already accessed it, it is on our website, but we'll send it around to you after the webinar. It includes all the details of how to do this, but I am going to run through some parts of it now. Feel free to chime in on the Q&A at any point if you have questions. We'll be monitoring it, so feel free to jump in. So there's a few ways you can be part of the process. I've outlined 5 of them here, and I'm going to go through each one. And it really does go in order of a timeline. So to start off with, a pre-budget brief to the Finance Committee. This process goes from July to December. So we're thinking here, back to that bread slide, we're really thinking about some of that earlier collecting the ingredients parts. So pre-budget briefs are submitted online to the Parliamentary Finance Committee, and it can be submitted in French or English. And the deadline this year is August 3rd. And you want to make it, it's really a short guide to what you want to see in the budget, but it should be compelling. So finance really almost always wants to hear about how your suggestions will make Canada more competitive. And they tend to give a little bit of preference to people who actually answer that question. And it's really important to note that the Finance Committee is multi-partisan. So there's MPs from all parties that sit on the Finance Committee. It is chaired by a Liberal. However, your audience is a multi-partisan one. This is the guide that the Finance Committee themselves put out. So I will also send this link to you all. And it basically just gives you what they like to see in a setup for the brief. So it shows you where you should have point form, where you should explain more about what you're asking for and how long it should be. The next way you can be involved is talking to your MP, and that should start as early as possible. And summer is, I mean, it's really the best time because typically MPs are now in their ridings listening to constituents. This is the time where they're really engaging. So, you know, you can always talk to your MP, but letting them know that you're in the process of putting in a pre-budget submission and letting them know what you want to see is a really good meeting ask or a really good topic to discuss with them. You can also ask your MP to support some of your asks or general science asks when they submit to the Department of Finance. So really it's another chance to get your asks echoed. MPs can send in letters and briefs to the Department of Finance saying, this is what my riding needs. And so being able to include your asks in that is a really helpful way to echo what you're already asking for. And really when you're talking to your MP, you want to frame it for your audience. We also have a how to talk to your MP guide and training, which I can also provide after the webinar. So if it's a government MP, you really want to frame it as, oh, okay, I appreciate the investments in science, and I think it's a great way to build on it by investing in X. So for example, I might frame it as, oh, Budget 2019 was a great investment in science, thanks to this Liberal government. We'd really like to see that built upon by seeing investments in scholarships and support for students. And if you have an opposition MP, try to frame it as an opportunity for this MP to champion science within their caucus and give a compelling reason why it matters. Especially the discussion and narrative around students and scholarships is particularly compelling. Another way you can participate is in pre-budget hearings, and this is another parliamentary finance committee process, so again, a multi-partisan process. These generally run through the summer, but they get really intense in the fall, so they try to hear from as many people as possible. So the finance committee themselves can tour around Canada, hosting town halls, inviting people to join an open call, and just basically come up to the mic and tell the finance committee what they'd like to see. But in Ottawa, it can also mean a formal process where you would appear before a committee on Parliament Hill and take questions, as well as like submit your speaking notes to interpreters and things like that. So the way finance chooses who will participate in pre-budget hearings is by those pre-budget submissions. So when you submit to finance by August 3rd, you are in an eligible pool of people who could be asked to testify. You don't have to. If they ask you to, you can say no if you're uncomfortable doing it. But if you were chosen, Katie and I have both testified at committee before and would be really happy to help you in that process. And really, you'll see that finance does ask from a broad scope of people to have input into the budget. So it's a mix of industry, civil society, academia, etc. And they're going to look at the entire budget, so not just science. So this is why it takes months. It's because they have hundreds of people come and testify. And another way you can be part of the process is to submit a pre-budget brief to the Department of Finance. And this usually happens late fall. You have to wait for the government to put out that call. So it's not tied to a specific timeline, but last year I think it was kind of later than normal. It was late November or early December, and they were collecting answers into January. This is really a government and public servant audience, so it's a little bit different, but it really is about reworking the pre-budget brief you've given to finance. It's really not a time to introduce new ideas, but to again echo what you've already asked for and make sure it gets into another set of hands. And the last part of the process that you can be a part of is giving feedback. So once the budget is tabled, you really want to take an opportunity to follow up with your MP or any of the public servants, for example, that you've had contact with. Let them know what you think, let them know that you're a resource for them and you'd like to continue to have a conversation.
So we can't just disappear once the budget is dropped. It's absolutely worth giving feedback, particularly if it was positive. I think it can be challenging to pick up the phone and say thank you sometimes. Sometimes it's easier to complain about what we didn't get, but framing it in a constructive way for your audience is really crucial on this point. And so I want to talk a little bit about why we do all of this. It generally, if you're part of the entire process, it takes up the majority of your year. But we do it because it works. And these photos are from a meeting with Nina Abraham, who is a senior researcher at UBC. And he got his MP to come to his lab and had meetings to discuss research funding, I think twice. And his MP happens to be the Minister of Justice. And getting a minister to come and meet is very difficult to do, but it does happen. People are eager to meet with scientists and to talk about research, because really it's a chance to talk to their constituents, and that's what MPs love to do. And really we know that Budget 2018 is a result of this, that it makes concrete differences in the lives of researchers, and it can result in increased funding for Canadian science. But more than that, it really shows a sustained interest in science. Katie showed you that bar graph of how mentions of science and research have doubled in the last year. Imagine if it just dropped off and everybody stopped talking about it. The government wouldn't think it's a priority for us anymore. So we have to continue to sort of foster that culture of science and government and really continue to say that it's important to us. And I also want to point out a paper from 2013 that shows, I think, what a lot of us would expect. So this is a frequency of contact between MPs and policy actors, and a lot of them you'll see meet with academics quite a bit, or NGOs quite a bit, depending on their party. Now, this was under the last government, to keep in mind. But one of the more interesting pieces in this, the quote was, "While most MPs are interested in independent policymaking, their motivation is most often derived from issues in their constituency and party agenda. An important lesson can be drawn from this observation, as arguments presented by policy actors may be more convincing if they correspond to parliamentarians' most important interests." So combining that frequency of contact and successful framing of your issue actually really does result in policymaking. There's research to prove it. And so I really want to drive home that while the pre-budget process is a little bit long, it is about the long game. It's not just about one budget. It's about building a relationship with the government, with the public service, and with you and your member of parliament. And I'm going to hand it back over to Katie to talk about what we're going to be asking for in Budget 2019.
Yeah, thanks, Kat. So we're in the process of actually writing our pre-budget brief as an organization. And I'll go over a few of the things that we're thinking of including. And I also just, want to touch a little bit on the current political context. Certainly, like we've mentioned, last budget was a good one for science, but there is absolutely more to do. And, certainly we're sort of getting the sense that the government kind of feels like, okay, the science box is checked. And I think, for me, this really brings home that fact that this kind of pushing for science can't just be something that happens, once in a blue moon around the Support the Report type campaign. Really, it has to be something that is ongoing. And scientists have to just make this, a part of what we do as researchers, is really making this effort to communicate with decision makers the same way we make an effort to communicate with the public. And, really that is the only way that we're going to have a government that continually has this on the agenda and doesn't just sort of feel like, okay, well, I gave you money in one budget, so we're good for a few years. So some of the things that we're going to be looking for in Budget 2019, and none of this is a big surprise, given what I mentioned was left out of Budget 2018. So certainly this piece of scholarships and support for students. So right now we're likely going to be pushing for the same numbers that were in the NAILA report for scholarships, and basically just pushing for that recommendation as is. The other big piece that the government didn't act on was increasing the research support fund. So, this is money for all of that sort of support for research that isn't actually going to, students or professors themselves. And we're going to be, pushing for an increase in that, also in line with what was recommended in the NAILA report. We're going to be pushing for an increase government science capacity. Many of the numbers that we've seen, show that many departments are basically still at 2012, 2013 levels of number of scientists in their department. So really they haven't recovered from the cuts that we saw under the last government. And we're still going to be pushing this issue of climate and atmospheric science. Shifting, away from funding research and more to some of these other areas that we work in, like ensuring evidence-based decision-making. We're considering pushing for departmental chief science advisors. We are sort of hearing that this is a direction that the government is already thinking of going in, that we would definitely support, and so we're considering pushing for that. And another issue that we've been following really closely is science integrity policies within government departments. So these are really, policies that affect how government scientists do their job and ensuring that their science is independent and that they're free to communicate to the public. So that's less of a money item, but something that we're going to be pushing for.
So now we have time for questions and answers, and we actually have one.
Let's test this answer live feature. Departmental chief science advisors, so this would mean that each department within government. So a few of them already have science advisors actually, like Health Canada, I believe, and
NRCan.
And so pushing for other departments that also have science as part of their mandate to also have this role as well. Happy to answer any other questions that you might have, whether it's on the content of the budget or any of these processes around budget process or engaging with your member of parliament.
Oh, that's okay. So Joe asked, when do we expect to have our budget brief ready to share publicly? We aim to have it always before the August 3rd deadline, but I would be more than happy to share sort of our outline with you shortly, Joe, if that's helpful, and it definitely will be available by the end of July.
And I'll just add too, Joe, that if you have any specific recommendations that would affect postdocs, we would certainly love to hear them. And certainly on the scholarships, support for students and early career researchers, we're still sort of looking for some more concrete recommendations. So we would love to see what you guys are putting in as well.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, we'd be happy to share that with you, Joe. I think, coming back to a little bit of what we were saying earlier, echoing each other's asks and keeping some of that similar language really drives home that the research community wants these things, and definitely gives the appearance of more cohesion, which I think is very helpful, as we witnessed last year.
And that's actually a good question that we've had in advance. We often have scientists say, isn't it redundant for a bunch of different groups to all submit similar things? Wouldn't it make more sense for us all to work together on one brief and submit that? Which, I really wouldn't recommend. I absolutely think it is better for the more briefs to be submitted. That shows that, realistically, if you have one brief with a whole bunch of names on it, I don't think that's counted as equally as each of those groups submitting their own brief. And exactly the word that Kat used, which is that echoing, is what I think is so important and why it's, really not at all redundant and actually is very strategic to have a number of different groups pushing for similar things, even if they're not identical, but just kind of make sure that everybody's going in the same direction. Well, if there's no other questions, then I think we'll end it there. And we just want to thank you for tuning in today. We'll send you some of these documents to use as a resource, and we're always happy to answer your questions in the future. If you start doing your brief or you start trying to get a meeting with your MP and run into some roadblocks, don't hesitate to reach out to us. We're happy to help.